Good evening, everybody, and a very warm welcome to the ICI Berlin. It's really great that so many of you could make it here. My name is Christoph Holzheit. My name is not on the program, so I will be extremely brief, but as the director of the ICI Berlin, I did want to say just a word of welcome to all of you, and in particular also to, Savi, contemporary, with whom we are cooperating today for the first time, and we are very happy and very glad about this possibility, this opportunity to cooperate in this first part of the symposium, the discursive program Wir sind alle Berliner 1884 to 2014, the symposium that, as you know, accompanies the exhibit at Savi Contemporary. And it's also a great pleasure to welcome in particular the curator of the exhibit, Simon Njami, and Anne Stoller, who will be given also this, the two of them will be giving the keynote lectures, from what I understand, of the symposium. I just wanted to say really a great thank you to all of you, to the keynotes, and to Savi, in particular to also Bonaventure and Ndikung, who will now give a more substantial introduction, I imagine, to both the exhibit and the symposium. Let me just say also that, we have a program of, two talks with lots of possibilities of discussion, I think, of questions and answers. And afterwards, you're also all invited to continue the conversation. Upstairs, there will be a small reception with some refreshments where we can continue the conversation. But first, of course, we're looking forward to the two keynotes. And with that, without further ado, I hand over to Bonaventure and Ndikung. Thank you very much for being here tonight.
So, I don't really know if I'm going to do a very substantial introduction, but I'm also here to welcome you, first and foremost, you know. So, thank you for coming, first to you. I'm basically doing a couple of thank yous because to do such a project, also with this short time, you know, and the difficulties of organizing such a project, you need a lot of people. So what I'm basically going to do now is to say a lot of thank yous, and then just hand over to Simon Njami, who will give a proper talk. You know, everybody's shifting to the other person, you know, so that's it. But I like that. So Simon will shift it to it. Exactly. Anyways, so first of all, a lot of thanks to the ICI for giving us this possibility of collaborating. It's the first time, and we're very happy about it. So thank you for that. For engaging also in this, because it was a kind of a trip to the unknown. You know, we started a kind of a kamikaze, you know, it got into it, and they were prepared to do that. So we're happy about that, but that's how Savi works, you know. We are kamikazes, that's it. So, then I would like to thank Professor Anne Stoller for coming all the way from New York for another project, but she found the time to come here to give a talk. And that's amazing. In a very tight schedule she found the time. So we're very happy about that, and we do very much appreciate it. Then, of course, to thank Professor Regina Rumhild, who's been, you know, kind of helping Savi since 2011. And we first met for a project at Savi, and since then she's always been there. You could just give her a call and she comes and does it. So she's going to introduce Anne Stoller. And of course, to thank Simon Njami, who took up the risk to do a project with such a small art institution in Berlin and put up, I would say, maybe one of the most successful exhibitions we've done, not only because of the number of people that came by, they were in their thousands, but that's not the point. It was about, you know, having the guts to grow up, to kind of look into a history that is really, at least in this space we exist in this German context, that is so often ignored or silenced. So we thank him for having those guts, you know, to do this kind of a project with us. Then I'll thank Mancha Jawara, who's going to be the keynote speaker for next week, and all the and all the other panelists that are going to come. So next week is from the 26th to the 1st of March. 26th of February to the 1st of March, we'll have roundtable discussions, performances, concerts, at the ICI, but also at the Kule Theatre, and we'll do a tour at Savi, or a couple of tours at Savi too for the exhibition. So then I think now it's really the most important part, because I want to thank the Savi people, some 20 to 23 people that work there on voluntary basis, that put up a lot of energy, put their health at risk. We don't have heating. So doing a lot of work, doing a lot of theoretical work, a lot of practical work. So I do want to thank them for this brilliant work, and also for having also again the chuspa, they have really the guts to propose other narratives, counter narratives, but many small counter narratives that really kind of shake the norm, the proposed norm. So especially in this space called Berlin. So thank you all for that. Then, of course, the Bundes Zentrale für politische Bildung, that was one of the few people that institutions that got up to support this project, so I would like to thank them too. That said, I would like to single out the core team for the preparation of this project, especially not only the exhibition but also these roundtables and the symposium. So Elena, Agudio, Anayega, Saskia Köpschal, and a lot of the people in the management team at Thabiso, I do say thank you to you. That's it. So before I call on Njami to come on the stage, I'd like to say one or two words about the exhibition itself. So in the past 3 months, we have had many people come by to see the show. So both art-affine and non-art-affine people. The discussions have been lively, controversial, but always very enriching. One point stood out very strong along the line, that people do indeed have an interest in the German colonial history. So it's not about the fact that people are not really interested in looking at it. It's also about who proposes what. So a lot of stuff is not proposed. So since we proposed that, we noticed that there are people that are actually interested in knowing much about that history. So we try to dig as deep as possible. So taking a look at our contemporary histories, be it around the occurrences in Denmark or in Paris, be it around the discourses and acts framed by Pegida and Legida. Those of you that are based in Germany, you know what I'm talking about. Be it about Boko Haram or otherwise, our histories are not only entangled geographically, but also in temporality. The actio that is exerted in Iraq today influences the frames the reactio in Delhi or in New York tomorrow. The partitioning of Africa in Berlin in 1884 and the cruelty of the colonial experience can be traced physically and psychologically to occurrences in both the West and the non-West today. As banal as that might sound, it was even more astonishing to notice that during a search for funding for this exhibition and for the conference, we received many rejections from funding bodies that specifically deal with German history. And I'll kind of do a paraphrasing on the responses we had to this project. So it was basically like this. We find your project very interesting, very important for Germany, but we as a funding institution focus on, for example, the Holocaust or the reunification history or some other moment of history. We are sorry, but your project doesn't meet our funding category. So that is what we receive from many people. So what is happening is a kind of an islandization, a kind of isolation of historical moments. So this islandization and the isolation of historical moments negate the continuation of history. And they negate the temporal entanglement of histories. Especially, it is worth mentioning that the same strategies and philosophies of dehumanization that were used in the Holocaust were appropriated from the colonies. And these for themselves were appropriated from the plantations. So there is a continuity in history. So historical moments are not islands, and history is bound to repeat itself, especially if it is silenced from one generation to another. So from our point of view, the project Wir sind alle Berliner, 1884 to 2014, was and is still an effort to deliberate on colonial practices and the repercussions, an effort to analyze the ideological, economical, political, and the humanitarian justifications that kind of underlay colonialism and still frame the asymmetric relations between the West and the non-West. But also, most importantly, to reflect on strategies of non-remembering. So the schedule for tonight will be as follows. I'll introduce Simon Njami. He'll say a word or two, or 10, or more, about the exhibition, about his concept, about his practice. And then Regina Rumhill will introduce Anne Stoller, who will again say something, you know. And then we continue next week. So, Simon Njami is a writer. Permit me, I have to do a proper introduction here because I think these things are very important to mention. So I'll read it and I'll read it properly. So Simon Njami is a writer and an independent curator, a lecturer, an art critic, and an essayist. So he has published several novels, starting from C'est qui ici, 1985, Les enfants de la cité, Les clandestins, and African Gigolo. That's 1989. So he wrote biographies for James Baldwin and Leopold Sédar Senghor, as well as several short texts on cinema and documentary film. Njami is the co-founder of Revue Noire, a journal of contemporary African and extra-Occidental art. So he used to be professor at the University of San Diego in California. He has served as artistic director of the Bamako Encounters, the African Photography Biennial, from 2001 to 2007. That's a long time. So Njami he was the curator of the Africa Remix, you know, a very important exhibition that influenced a lot of us, by the way. And he also co-curated the first African pavilion at the 52nd Venice Biennial. He curated the first African art fair in Joburg and was artistic director of the Luanda Triennial in 2010, and he did stuff at the Pisha Biennial and the Salon Urbain de Douala in 2010. So his exhibition, The Divine Comedy, Heaven, Hell, Purgatory, by contemporary African artists, is currently touring. So the first station was the MMK in Frankfurt am Main. So it's currently at the Scott Museum in Savannah in the US, and it will be shown in the National Museum of African Art in the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, and at the Museu Berardo in Lisbon in Portugal. So it goes without saying that one of the most important on this list is the exhibition they did at Savvy Contemporary. So thank you very much for coming, and yes, be well.
Yes, indeed, the most important show I've done in my life was that in Berlin. First of all, because I don't think I'm a Berliner, so it's kind of a very ironic thing. And I don't know who thinks he's a Berliner. I don't know what is a Berliner. But I've heard about the Berlin Conference, and I think that we're still suffering or dealing with the, how do they say in war, the collateral damages of this conference. And if the Berliner thinks that they had nothing to do with all this colonial history, they're wrong. of course, you are special, and you know the history. So it's not only that the conference was held in Berlin, and also that the Germans took their part in the bargain. There's something you probably read the title of my presentation, which is The Heart of Lights. Of course, it's a reference to the heart of darkness. And I guess I'm going to deal with the issue of color, light, darkness, white, black, and its relationship to the Berlin Conference and to the colonial adventure or the colonial business. And I think at the same time I'm going to help most of you, because there are more white people here than black people, to start maybe another kind of exercise. I don't know why, personally I'm bored by that. I don't know why. There's a kind of a speciality, especially in the United States, of black people discussing the black body. It's always how it's used, what is the black body? Am I black? What is the blackness? So I guess I'll deal with the white body. Because I always wondered why there was no conferences, no seminars, nothing about the white body, how it's used, how it's... especially, I'm coming from Kampala, where there was a young curator who was dealing with self-hatred. And the show she wanted to do was about fairness. It's very interesting the way the advertisement company used certain words. Fairness, to be fair, means to be lighter. So there is all this campaign where some young African girls are destroying their skins with those products. But what is paradoxical is that when I was reading books from 17th, 18th century, even 19th century, the criteria of beauty in the West was to be as white as possible. And now that those guys are subdued by whatever publicity wants to be lighter, I've heard that the trend in the West was to have a tan. So, story is always amusing. So, it's my intention to help you, my intention to deal with lights. And of course, the lights I'm going to address are the lights that supposedly enlighten the humanity. Those lights that started after the French Revolution. It's really funny, again, I'm coming back from Kampala, and there's a lot of power cuts. And I think that ever since the French Revolution, there have been a bunch of power cuts in the way. And those great philosophers were trying to enlighten us. I will come back to those cuts. But I was kidding when I told you that I will try to work on the white body. I don't know what to say about it. I'm going to deal rather with the Berlin Conference. And since I happen to live in a place that was the cradle of the so-called lightness, I'm going to deal with France. There's a quote by Senghor. Say, don't tell me that I don't like France. I am not France, I know it. And when I was thinking of whatever I could say, I remember those 3 kids who killed 2 of my friends. And I made a parallel between what Senghor said in the 30s and what they could have said. Don't tell me that I don't like France. I'm not France, I know. So France is the place where I live. France is the country of Voltaire, Rousseau, Montesquieu, Diderot, all those guys. But besides hosting the Berlin Conference, I guess you know that Germany took its chair, and bargain. The country where I'm coming from was a German protectorate. Started to write Cameroon with a K. Germany had some little property in Togo. And last but not least, I'm not here to deal with the German guilt. These are just facts. They own Namibia, where the first experimentation on human were made to prepare what would come later. So just to name a few examples so that some of you, but I know that you all know your history, you're all familiar with your history, but some people outside of this circle of intelligent people would not say, we German, we have nothing to do with colonization. Germany has to do with colonization. So, the title of this thing is The Heart of Light. It could have been the heart of lightness. I like this double meaning in lightness because light means light, not heavy. And light means also what allow me to see you. So if light would be at the same time, I'd say white to make a long story short, and not heavy, then dark would be black and not in proud, but heavy. And heaviness they took from I don't know where. But then to go back to those kids who would have said like Senghor, don't tell me I don't like France, I'm not French, I know. I love the intellectuals. I love them. I love even more those who claim to be intellectual. And there were a bunch of intellectuals in France. They were teaching in the suburbs. And they wrote a paper after the Charlie thing happened. It was January the 11th. It was very interesting to read the paper. I'm not an internet person, but a friend of mine sent me a link and told me, after having read something I wrote for the Spiegel, they said, oh, these people, they're on your line. They're just one or two things that bothers me. First of all, I hate to have intellectual from the French suburbs being on the same line than me. And I read what they've read, and it was very interesting to see how they wrote it. They were so full of themselves. They said something like, we intellectual, we have to take into account what happened, and we have to react about it. Well, so far so good. And then they started to react, unfortunately. Maybe the paper should have stopped there. I feel like we have to react about it. Unfortunately, they reacted. And they say, well, we understand those kids, understand them very well. We can afford to have cars that they can't afford to have. We can afford to have jackets and shoes that they can't afford to have. Just look at an intellectual from the suburbs and see what kind of jackets and what kind of shoes they have. Those kids are not stupid. I don't think nobody would have the same jacket and same shoes. But anyway, they thought they were very hype. And they went on like this, and then there was the bomb. The bombing was that all of a sudden those great intellectuals who understand everything, who are universalist and whatever, well, like the problem with those kids that they haven't read Voltaire. That was just the beginning. They did better. And then they quoted a great French philosopher, Nicolas Sarkozy. And his Berlin, you see, his Dakar speech. And of course, the great philosopher Nicolas Sarkozy, I've never heard of Hegel. I heard that he's reading a book now, I think Anna Karenina. He read the first 10th, and he's like, I was trying to say, oh, it's a good book. maybe in 2 years he'll be done with that book. So basically the Dakar Discourse by Sarkozy, you're all familiar with it. He was, without knowing, quoting Hegel. He was saying to those people in Dakar that he loved them very much, but they just have one thing that doesn't work. They haven't entered history yet. So here you are to a group, I don't know how many there were, of so-called intellectuals in the suburbs writing a paper to react on what happened on January the 11th. And the only thing they came up with is Sarkozy. Of course, I was surprised, but I shouldn't have been surprised because I think that we're living in strange times. I think that the extremism and the nationalism haven't been that strong since before the Second World War. When we look at the last election, the European elections, remember, European community was built in order to get rid of war, in order to create a better understanding between community. But in those European election, the first party, as far as France is concerned, was the National Front of Marine Le Pen, whose program is very simple: kick them out, kick them all out. And we're in 2015 now, and people are like wanted the borders back. Of course, Africa has something in common with Berlin, not with Germany. It's this wall. Of course, your wall was much more famous than the walls in Africa, because you probably had the power to make publicity about it. But the Berlin Conference was just an operation that built walls all over Africa, where literally would build here after negotiating. I want this, and then they would say, okay, they will draw a line where two families will be splitted. But that was the fate of the whole of Africa. But then to go back to those great intellectual French, I'm sure the German are better. Anyway, they were so full of their superiority, of the illusion of their superiority. They were so full of their history that they didn't even realize that they were just reproducing this kind of barrier between me and the other. I'm not going to elaborate on the other, nor on the post-otherness. That will be your job. But to see that some intellectual can just talk like a bunch of people were talking in the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century. There's been a moment, there's a telephone that is calling somebody. To see that those people are so far from the thing just made me think that the problem they had, the problem that French have, name me a great French intellectual. Even a friend of mine that I kind of liked, I heard that he's giving lectures that are 8 years old. So I'd rather have Mamadou Koulibaly as a model. Scheiße. When I say Koulibaly, it's like Smith of something. It has nothing to do with it's just a very common name. But I'd rather have to come up with another name. Anyway, whoever as a model, because none in the world would know him. So I can progress. The problem in France is that everybody, the concierge, the cop, thinks he's Voltaire. Nobody told them that Voltaire was dead and that they needed to do their homeworks. I said, Diderot, we're the land of Diderot. He's dead too. Nowadays, they're the land of Marine Le Pen and Nicolas Sarkozy. But I think that it was because, and it is because, of of something that we shall call whiteness. I'm going to quote Jean-Paul Sartre describing whiteness. Nothing personal, just intellectualism. Jean-Paul Sartre said, "For 3,000 years, the white man has enjoyed the privilege of seeing without being seen. He was only a look. The light from his eyes drew each thing out of the shadow of its birth. The whiteness of his skin was another look, condensed light. The white man, white because he was man, white like daylight, white like truth, white like virtue, lighted up the creation like a torch and unveiled the secret white essence of beings." I didn't write it. So there's a kind of equivocal game on words with this darkness and blackness and etc. And of course, when you say that you have dark ideas, you don't mean that you're very happy. When it says this guy has dark plans, you don't mean you're very happy. And even if this filmmaker turned Darth Vader, who should have been Dark Vader, into Darth Vader, and even this force, there was a dark side of the force. So Conrad wrote The Heart of Darkness. And I wanted to borrow this Heart of Darkness from him. It was published in 1902, some decades after the Berlin Conference. I remember when I was a kid, I was a violent kid. There are things I didn't like. And I didn't like the title of this book. So who is this guy again? And I read it. And finally I liked it because the book was dealing with the white madness, not the darkness of Africa. But during those days, there were a bunch of people producing a certain type of literature. So Conrad was at least intelligent to deal with his own madness and to deal with a quote. Yes? And to deal with a quote, I don't know what it is exactly, nor where it's coming from. But it goes like, Africa, the tomb of white man. So I guess that this was a reflection on this heart of darkness. But then, there were people, and it's not a surprise, there are people that would not be in any kind of essentialism, trying to categorize and box people. Those guys were the artists, not the politician, not the intellectual, the artist. And Africa, this continent, have been helping the world so much. It's never acknowledged. We should do something about it. Bonaventure should create a fund to advertise all the good that Africa did to humanity. And Conrad wrote that book in 1902. Then Pablo Picasso was visiting the Museum of Trocadero in 1905. And of course, despite what he was told, despite what his parents would tell him, Picasso was first and foremost an artist, and he could only believe his senses and his eyes. So this is what William Rubin Picasso said after he visited the Museum of the Trocadero. Only an artist who have been able so early and so easily to imitate the sort of painting his father championed, Mr. Ruiz, that was the name of the father, was a painter and a professor at the Spanish Academy. I don't know why Picasso didn't call himself Pablo Ruiz, but Pablo Picasso, which was the name of his mother. Anyway, you all know this story. Let's go back to the thing. The sort of painting his father championed could have so readily called its bluff. could have so soon become aware that something was profoundly wrong with what it said and the way it said it. Precisely what was wrong would only become entirely clear to Picasso in the shock and the revolution he experienced before the tribal masks and fetishes, quote unquote, in the Musée d'Ethnographie du Trocadéro. At that moment, he said later, I realized what painting was all about. So, it's always interesting to see some art historian going to lecture in Africa and to teach those kids about art history. They never mention that all what is called modern art came from this shock, came from the encounter of Picasso with some African masks and fetishes. We talk about history. I think it's Walter Benjamin. There's always kind of, some people say it's him, some people say it's somebody else. But anyway, it doesn't matter if it's him or not. It's this quote about history, always written by the conqueror. Well, there's something that the so-called conqueror did not realize, is that in Latin America, in Africa, wherever they've been, they were seen. It's just them who didn't realize, like Sartre would say, they didn't realize that they were seen. Picasso helped Africans. It's always so paradoxical to call the bluff of the colonizer. It was like, here's this guy who went to see our stuff, and we've been told that we're just kids, only able to make sandcastle by the beaches, and the first wave would take them away, we would up them up. And there's this guy, and then kind of appreciated that he's saying that we're not bad. And to give you credit, when I'm in a country, I always manage to have something positive about the country. The only thing positive about this country, I'm going to say, is Leo Frobenius, who wrote but in the same years that Africa was not what people believe, but that Africa had a civilization. And I always love the irony of history, because it's because of Frobenius and of Picasso that the negritude was created. Which means that it's really not a matter of color, it's a matter of intelligence. You're all familiar with the Latin definition, intelligere, which means to be able to understand. That's why probably we make a lot of mistakes when we think that some people are intelligent. Because to be intelligent is not what people say they are. But then, we have Picasso, we have Frobenius, and we have a great intellectual, Ernest Renan. We're going backwards now. We're preparing the Berlin Conference. He wrote in his Intellectual and Moral Reform Treaty, 1871, nature has created a race of workers. It is the Chinese race that masters a marvelous hand dexterity without almost no sense of honor. Govern it with justice and take from it, as a reward for such a labor, a large retribution to the benefit of the conqueror. It will be satisfied. A race of soil laborers is the nigger. Be for him good and human, and everything will be all right. A race of master and soldiers is the European race. May everyone do what he was created for, and everything will be all right. So now you see the Berlin Conference coming. And a couple of years later, I was so disappointed when I was a kid and I found this, because there's one thing to talk about universality, there's another thing to defend your own little petty garden. Victor Hugo, who fought against the death penalty, who fought for the abolition of slavery, Victor Hugo himself, in 1879, we're getting close to the conference, said, God offers Africa to Europe. Spread what overfills you in this Africa, and at the same time, solve your social problems. Change your proletarian into landlords. Go, build things, build roads, build harbors, build cities, grow, cultivate, colonize, multiply. Victor Hugo. Disappointing, isn't it? Anyway, Jules Ferry was the head of state of France at that time, and Jules Ferry would be taking part of the Berlin Conference. And Jules Ferry, before the Chamber of Deputies, the French Parliament, said in July 1885, I love the way those people are so full of themselves. They don't even realize a bit of humility maybe will make it better, but no. Jules Ferry says, when a country like France set a step on a foreign and wild country, could it only be concerned by the extension of its business and be led by greed as its only motivation? Country like France. Huh? And then the other European country might feel unease because it goes on, you know, as French are, con questo naso. So he goes on. This generous nation, which opinions rules the civilized Europe, and whose ideas have conquered the world, have been given the highest mission by Providence. It's not Providence, a city in the United States, it's the Providence. That of the emancipation, the call of the lights and of freedom of races, of people still enslaved by ignorance and despotism. Will it, in his hand, extinguish the torch of civilization against the deep darkness of the Anan? The Anan is in Asia, as you know. France would be defeated there later. It's another story. And even if few voices in the political arena, like Clemenceau, are trying to call the bluff of all this, Clemenceau said that Clemenceau was a military. He won the First World War for the French. But at the same time, he was the first one to host the first Pan-African Congress. So, you know, I'm not really into militaries and into warriors, but again, at times, one can be surprised. You've heard Victor Hugo, huh? And here's what Clemenceau said. Let us not try to cover violence in the hypocrite name of civilization. I think we all agree. I should stop the crap. But all this was not a game. It was pure hypocrisy, like Clemenceau stated it. The perfect definition of the play that is opening on the 16th of November, 1884. And that gathered 13 European countries, to which joined the United States of America and Russia. That was Russia, then became something else, and that is Russia again. And I don't know if somebody told Mr. Vladimir Putin about colonization and about the fact that we're supposed to be on modern times, but it's another story. That's his business. So those guys sat on a table and started to discuss. At least the hypocrisy didn't reach the level of discussing about the wellness of Africa. It was business. It was business. And I guess if Bismarck called for the conference, it was because he defeated the French in 1870 and had the power to do so. Bismarck's problem was just that we have to have an open continent, free market. He didn't have many possessions there, so he wanted to regulate the market the colonial market. Of course, countries like Portugal and France, who had some shares there, were against it. They were like, you have to pay taxes, etc., etc. Anyway, they got along, they organized everything, they split it, divided, multiplied, killed, and the deal was done. But it's so ironical, this deal, that, in France we always laugh about the Belgians. Now, all those stupid jokes, the Belgian would be the main character. But on that bargain, the best of them was Leopold II. He had this little tiny small country, and he inherited of millions of square meters that he called, because he maneuvered before. The others were like, we're powerful. He worked, established a bunch of things there in Congo. And what is ironic is that he called this country that he was given. But he was giving the country not like the others. No, France was owning this. Leopold had Congo as a private property. It is quite interesting when the French say that they're stupid. I mean, this guy is nothing, no war. He maneuvered. But then they managed. And even if France did not do bad in those negotiations, he maintained quite a great portion of Africa. But there was something France had a problem with. It was the Alsace and the Lorraine. Those two French regions that have lost after Napoleon III was defeated by the Prussian. So the name, just for you to laugh, some people have a sense of humor, and I think that the Belgians have. The name that Leopold gave to his land was the independent state of Congo, known now with an even more comic name as the Democratic Republic of the Congos. Well, we'll see if the kid is going to change the constitution, and we'll see what happened. But all those agreements did not cool down what was going on in Europe. Europeans, they always need a war. And I think there's even a theoretician who said that every now and then we need a war for economy. I mean, the United States make a lot of money out of the Second World War and the First one, the Marshall Plan, etc. Well, they were fighting, and they needed something. The French could not stand this Alsace and Lorraine that was still in the Germans' hand, and the Germans would have loved to expand. But they were all happy thanks to somebody called Gabrielo Princip. He was a Serbian, a nationalist, and he shot the Archduke Francois Ferdinand and his spouse, the Duchess of Hohenberg. Right after that, the First World War spread because of this little incident. Nowadays, when you have this kind of thing, Boko Haram is like what? At least 500, if not, they don't go. Well, Paris, we didn't have that much. Altogether, 20. Well, there were two, but it was a Duchess and a Grand Duke. That's how the First World War started. This First World War costed a lot. I'm not talking about the number of people. I'm thinking of Guillaume Apollinaire, who was wounded. He had a piece of metal in his brain, a piece of metal that would lead him to death slowly. I think that a very subtle torture wouldn't have been better. I think that the fate of Apollinaire is kind of summarized what is called in history books the Great Butchery. But then, Theodor Herzl, because it's part of this colonialism, it's part of this man is a wall for man, it's part of this story repeating or story being forgotten. Those people who were revolutionary, they were terrorists. They fought to have a piece of land. They suffered like maybe only the Africans suffered. I've forgotten all this nowadays. But back then, Theodor Herzl was fighting and was campaigning to have a Jewish state in Palestine. But then 1917, the Tsar of all the Russia was chased out by a guy, nobody knew his name. I have to read it myself to remember it. Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, of course, was Lenin. And this was going to change the way the world was dancing. It was not anymore about us, the Westerners, etc. There was a new empire that would raise, an empire that saved the civilized world, actually. If I was a warrior or a captain, I would never fight the Russians in Russia. Napoleon was defeated. Hitler was defeated. Who's coming next? I mean, it's too cold there to kill properly. But let's go back to France. From the 20s, France was burning. Burning in a certain sense, burning with excitement, burning with, we call that les années folles. As if people knew, without knowing, that it was just a little parenthesis from one war to the other. That's why Coco Chanel were doing her thing. That's why all those vibrating Paris, Le Gay Paris, was existing. And Paris is called the city of light. And that's also where the Negroes, let's call them, would get together and discuss about themselves. That's where the first anti-colonial novel was written by a black person. It was Claude McKay, a poet from the Harlem Renaissance. The novel was Banjo. And there's always those paradoxes in France, because in the 20s, I think 24, they gave the Goncourt Prize to René Marin for a novel called Batoila, true nigger novel. And Marin was a small administrator, colonial administrator. Marin was from Guyana. And, well, his novel is kind of nice, nothing special. But he wrote a foreword. And because of that foreword, he was put out of his job simply because he was saying one or two little things about the colonies and the way the colony were treated. Later on, I always loved Albert, but when I discovered that Albert was part of the people who created they created an organization that would fight against imperialism and colonization. It was founded in Brussels again, in 27, and one of the founding members was Albert Einstein. And then Leon Blum, socialist, at the same time, while Albert and his friends are founding this association against imperialism and colonialism. Leon Blum, who is said to be a very open-minded person, said, "We admit the right and even the duty for the superior race to attract to them those who haven't reached the same level of culture, and to invite them to the progress achieved thanks to the effort of science and industry." Another thing, everybody was benefiting from that. Marcel Griol, for those of you who are ethnographers, went in Africa for a scientific journey. That journey that at least gave us the opportunity to discover the ghost Africa, l'Afrique fantôme, because Michel Léris was part of the expedition. But this expedition would bring back to France. Let me tell you, because, I mean, you need to see the numbers. The numbers are amazing. Okay, they came back with 3,500 objects stolen that would be stored in French mankind museums, and maybe French offered some to Germans or to Brits, to the great European family. But it was a scientific journey, of course. The pieces were just offered. One last quote that jumps over World War II is from the very distinguished daily newspaper Le Monde, because Le Monde was starting to feel that this whole colonial business was falling apart. So Le Monde wrote in 1946, "It is out of question for France to renounce its moral, cultural, scientific, economic influence, to abandon what is its work, to deny its civilizing mission." We know about the civilizing mission. A couple of years later, after the war, the UN wrote a declaration. They wrote that convention in 1948, December the 10th. It says, the fundamental human right that they wanted to preserve and guarantee the fundamental human rights in the dignity and the value of the human person, in the equality of rights between men and women. Which reminds me of a story. I have a friend who is lecturing. She specialized in, how would you call that, minority studies at that time. And she was dealing with the Black Panther Party, etc. And I was attending one of her conferences. And she was telling us about this emancipation movement. And I was struck by the fact that the words she was using for women were exactly the same word the African or the black people fighting for their freedom were using. So maybe that's why women are there in this United Nations thing. And there was another thing, the universal and effective respect of human rights and fundamental liberties for all, no matter their race, sex, language, and religion. Maybe we should take a minute of silence for the death of this declaration. I have the feeling that no political leader have read them, be it in the south, north, east. No? I shall just repeat it once more. It's a good. The universal and effective respect of human rights and fundamental liberties for all, no matter their race, sex, language, and religion. Well, it's time to end. I think I've done my time, more or less. Isn't it, Dr. Bonaventure? There is in this fight, which is a metaphoric fight again, between darkness and lightness, there's a guy who defeated Hitler before the Russians and the Americans did. It was in 1936, here in Berlin, Olympic Games. His name was Jesse Owens. He won 4 golden medals, which didn't fit the plan. I mean, the Aryan race, fallen from Olympus, was supposed to win everything. And here's this guy, 4-time golden medal. For the first time, the chancellor was so stunned that he shut his mouth and left the stadium. William Du Bois said in the early 20th century that he believed that the 20th century will be that of the color line. What might believe that he was wrong? I don't know. My friend in London during the Maggie Thatcher's years, where they had to be kind of radical and fight for what was left of the welfare of a certain way of life, created an association bunch of association actually, and one of them was Autograph, Association of Black Photographers. I remember when I visited them, I saw the list of the photographers. There were some Indians, some Greek Cypriots, some Pakistanis, etc. And I asked them, what is this Black Association all about? They said, well, it's just a non-WASPs. So black was not a color anymore, it was a political statement. But still, Bonaventure mentioned that I curate every now and then, so let's go back to art. I'm going to quote an art historian. It's a very objective quote. He's dealing with color. It's taken from a book called Chromophobia. And this is how he's talking about white or whiteness. I found it so funny, dealing with colonizations and all this. There is a kind of white that is more than white. And this was the kind of white. There is a kind of white that repels everything that is inferior to it, and that is almost everything. This was that kind of white. There is a kind of white that is not created by bleach, but that itself is bleach. This was that kind of white. This white was aggressively white. It did its work on everything around it, and nothing escaped. I'm done.
So I think they're understood. So 2 questions, if there's any question around.
They're on the right.
Okay.
The hairy kid.
Thank you very much. Savi and ICI really is a combination of 2 of my favorite things in Berlin, so thank you for that. You were talking about universalism at some point, and I wondered whether this work of reconstructing, regaining something from the past was open for a notion of cosmopolitanism, really. Whether in all this black and white, there was some shade of gray that maybe included both. Thank you.
Well, we're only interested in gray, because as you know, nor black nor white are colors, according to the scientific definition. Black absorbs everything and white is the... Anyway, there were grays. As I told you, among the people of goodwill, there were bridges. The artist, for instance, the surrealist artist, on 31, I think, there was a colonial exhibition. They went there, and they were distributing posters, etc., and fighting what was happening there. I mean, the story is never black and white. I was just making it funny around this lightening problem. But cosmopolitanism is, I think, today more effective than yesterday, simply because of traveling, visas, etc., etc. Back to the days, you have to remember that black people were in Europe, whether to study or there were even civil servants for some of them when it started to open up. And they were more busy trying to keep their position and something else. But still, what is interesting is that you can't think about yourself if you are in the cradle that brought you to life. You always need a distance. And most of the thinkers those who made a revolution. That was a revolution that was aiming to the universal, did it outside of their countries, because then they could really see what was happening. We don't know what we think we know, said the other guy. So basically, today is much more interesting. I remember when I was a kid, when I was going to New York or to places like that, I was always surprised, wondering what I should do when I would see a black person nodding at me. So I would look, maybe he's talking to a friend. No, that's kind of... but today, I shall just quote, unfortunately, a Cameroonian artist, Bili Bidjocka. We were in Tokyo for some show, and there was an artist talk, and the Japanese were telling him about the village, etc., etc. And Bili did a project in some remote village before we would come back to Tokyo. And Bili said, well, I've seen a bit more in common between the people in the village I were and the people in the village my family come from than with me. I say in Revenge, when I'm in Tokyo, I feel at home, like in New York, like in all those places, because probably a real cosmopolitan city is a city where nationality have to disappear. First of all, because the real capital is built by strangers, whether they're coming from the Baden-Württemberg or coming from Munich, etc. They don't belong to the capital, and that's what allows those bridges. People would say, I'm a Berliner, not necessarily I'm a German. I call myself a Parisian, not a French, there's a lot of wonderful and beautiful gray zones in capitals. There's also some dark corners, of course.
So one more question, so the last one.
Okay. Yeah, what's your take on globalization? Because it's an interesting word. Because the world was always a globe, and then suddenly there's globalization. But globalization to me is when you lose yourself and be like another, and then you become more enlightened and you are lighter, then you are a citizen of globalization. So that's my take. What is your take on globalization, and how does it fit in this whole global artistic circus?
I know nothing about the global artistic circus. I mean, maybe you know better. But I like that. It's problematic at times, but I like this neologism that Homi Baba created on the global. I always introduce myself as a Bassa citizen. The Bassa people don't even call themselves Cameroonian, but I travel the world. But I think that the notion of point of view is essential. If globalization is 1904, like Orwell stated it, I'm not interested. But if globalization is exchanging, then I'm more interested. Where are you from?
Ghana.
Ghana. And Kwame Nkrumah, Pan-Africanism. It's an impossible dream, useful probably. But I think that if you want to give something, or if you want to take something, you need to know who you are. So if you're in the global plusha, you might not even know where you're coming from, and hence not know what is it you want. So if globalization is that we have all to consume the same thing at the same moment, at the same hour, I don't want it. But anyway, I don't feel concerned by this. I'm much more a local person than a global person.
So thank you very much, Njami.
Good evening. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the Institute of European Ethnology, which is my academic home base, and particularly also from a space we call the Labor Kritische Europäisierungsforschung, which is probably the laboratory of critical Europeanization studies. The lab is an open, self-organizing, interdisciplinary space of research and discussion where we aim at rethinking and decentering Europe from the perspective of post-colonial struggles and global entanglements. And the lab has been collaborating with Savvy Contemporary for a longer time already, and I'm really happy to be here, to be involved in this, in another joint venture that we do together with Bonaventure and the colleagues at Savvy Contemporary by supporting and organizing this set of discursive events here, this one at this very nice place of the ICI, around the magnificent exhibition Wir sind alle Berliner, curated by Simon Njami, who just told us more about the idea and the histories behind it. Now, it's my great pleasure and honor to welcome Anne Stoler, a famous fellow anthropologist from the New School of Social Research in New York. You will know her all. She is Willy Brandt Distinguished University Professor of Anthropology and Historical Studies, and she is the founding director there of the Institute of Critical Social Inquiry. And I'm quite sure that most of you will be well acquainted with her work and will know at least one of her numerous books, because whoever is interested in post-colonial thought, and more particularly in issues of colonial governance, in the politics of empire, and in critical race theory, must inevitably come across her work. There's practically no way to miss it. And for the reflexive anthropological project I'm involved in, of critically inquiring into the making of Europe, past and present, Anne's writings are indeed indispensable. And from all that work that is important here, I will only mention the work with which I started my reading, her Race and the Education of Desire, which was published in 1995 and which has by now become a classical text. Here I learned to challenge Foucault's history of sexuality and its implicit Eurocentrism by re-examining it from the perspective of a colonial history of race, and thus bringing to light the interdependence between these histories. By making Foucault's theory travel to the colonies, its meaning and scope are relocated and extended at the same time. And with this pioneering book and all that came after it on that issue, it has become clear that the history of European sexuality, as much as Europe itself, cannot be understood without understanding how it was educated and shaped within the colonial relations of empire. And today, Anne Stoler will present some of her more recent thought, some way about it. It will be about her most recent book, Imperial Debris, but also it will include thoughts from her still outcoming book with the title Duress, and it will also relate to a project on decolonizing knowledge, what she told me earlier. So here, this will invite us to even go one step further, I think, and rethink the current global moment in terms of a complex, continuing colonial present. And this perspective resonates strongly with the exhibition at Savvy contemporary, where we come to understand that there is still this situation of an ongoing aftermath of the Berlin Congo Conference, and that we are all, in that sense, Berliners thrown together in that aftermath of that conference. And now I'm very much looking forward to hearing more about the persistence of imperial debris and why it matters now. So let's welcome Anne Stoller.
Well, thank you all for coming. I'm not sure most of you are here for me at all. So I'm not even sure how much time I should be taking up, since this is both a commemoration, quote unquote, of the Berlin Conference, and it's also a commemoration of Simon's exhibition at Savvy. However, I thought what I would do, there's so many connections that I would like to make to what Simon just talked about, and I fear that if I do so, I'm never going to get to some of what I had meant to talk about. But some of what he's brought up about France is the preoccupation of a lot of the work I've been doing over the last decade. And it's not only in the work on imperial debris, but on something I call colonial aphasia, race and the disabled histories of France, which is going to be a part of this new book coming out next year, which is called Duress, Concept Work for Our Times. And one of the things I was trying to do in this aphasia book is really get rid of the vocabulary of forgetting. Oubli. Ah, I don't know how I just forgot that. The French have not forgotten their colonial history. What we have to try to understand, and we're not talking about just the French at all, is how something can come in and out of focus and in and out of bounds. Simone de Beauvoir wrote about rape in the Algerian War. There have been tons of books about colonialism, 1950s, 1960s, much earlier on. What is so striking is that misrecognition between words and things. There's an amazing film that I don't know, Simon, if you've seen it, called Caché. I don't know how many of you have seen it. It's not the one about chocolate. It's a much, much more searing one about a well-heeled, white, upper middle class, bourgeois French intello who doesn't quite remember his childhood and finds a video placed at his door and doesn't know where it comes from, and I'm just going to truncate it enormously. It turns out that it's a video placed at his door that comes from the little boy whose parents were killed in 1961 in Paris when Algerians were massacred. And he was sent away from this home where he was adopted into. The cachet, hidden, is the hiddenness of this personal story. It's the hiddenness of a political story. It's the hiddenness of a colonial history. And a very dear French intellectual friend of mine, I won't name him because he's too close to me, when I said, Cachet is all about the colonial history of France, he said, "Oh, Annie, that's amazing, you're right." And so that's troubling. That to me is very troubling. So what my work has been about for the last, I would say for the last 10 years, I came to the New School a decade ago, it was just on the cusp of 9/11, is to understand something about how these imperial formations make themselves opaque to us and to themselves, why they are both tangible and intangible at the same time, where those opacities lie. Eduardo Glissant said it gorgeously. Of course, I forgot the quote because I don't have it in front of me. But he says, these are the hardest, colonialisms are the hardest kinds of dominations to get hold of because of that opacity, because it's built into them. So the work that the savvy organizers wanted me to talk about was Imperial Debris, but it's a book that I've written. It's out there. It's being used. People are here because they read it. I'm not going to go and tell you the whole story of it again. It's an invitation. It's an invitation to stop thinking about colonialism and colonialism, but to think about colonial formations not in the passé composé, not in the past tense, nor is it quite arguing that the colonial is present everywhere. But what I am trying to get at is something more subtle and more difficult, that there is a presence, that there is an actualization, that there is a part of the colonial that endures and that has a durability, an uneven kind of sedimentation that courses through almost everything we do in often benign and innocuous ways. So what I had wanted to talk about this evening is why, after some 30 years of studying colonialisms, and I say that in the plural, in so many different guises, why that remains such a difficult and challenging project, that it is never just an intellectual one, that it is an intellectual one, that it's an aesthetic one. That's probably the thing that's changed most in all of my work. I was just speaking to a former student, now a wonderful professor at Barnard, Anupanurao, last 2 days ago, just about writing, about what the demand is on how we write and what the form it takes when we're talking about imperial debris, that is both the debris that is material in a very material form. Jamaica Kincaid has written about it. Lots of people have written about it. But it also has a psychological debris as well. And it demands something else. It demands something else that you can't write as a social scientist. You know, you can't just write it through novels. The novels have become crucially important to me. In fact, Marguerite Duras's Barrage contre la Pacifique, seawall, she talks about the white pelt of these Frenchmen, that they could never be white enough. They were constantly cleaning them because they couldn't get them white enough. She was writing about it, and that was as a petit blanc, as a, you know, little white. This writing, this book, Imperial Debris, I had the idea for this thinking about landscapes that are scarred and ruins, and was angry. I found myself angry with the literature coming out on ruins of modernity and the ruins of the Colosseum, because it seemed, and even the ruins of Israel, because for me, it seemed like ruins really was missing the point. What's really at issue, and I tried to really pull out in the Imperial Debris book, is that what is at stake is not ruin as a noun, but to ruin as a verb, ruination. What happens to people's lives, not just what's left, and we can look at the overgrown vines and feel nostalgic for them, but what people are left with. That the concern is not to go and identify the ruins that are named ruins, but the ruination that goes by other names, that is cut off from the colonial history of which it was a part and where those damages were many of them initiated. So what we have is a kind of renaming that's so benign. It's either environmental degradation or it's racial discrimination, and everybody's got it. It's all over the place, but it is absolutely severed from the colonial history of which it was a part. Last night I was talking, I see one of my wonderful students out there smiling. I don't want to say the same thing said last night. I know none of you were there, but it still feels kind of cheap and tacky. You know, you go to Berlin once every 4 years and you end up giving the same talk twice. I don't know, I can't do that. Which is why I was so anxious about this, because the savvy people just told me a few days ago and said, oh, maybe you'll do a little question and answer period, Anne. I said, that's fine. And then I see that, you know, this thing is out to 200 people. But what's really important for me in what I was trying to do in that book, and that Derek Walcott really enabled and said it better, so much better than I could have said it, in one of his poems, The Ruins of a Great House. He says, colonialism is the rot that remains when the men are gone. And when I read it, it was like, oh my God, you know, one sentence got hold of something that I'm still grappling with, I'm still challenged by. I still don't even know if I've carried it further than Derek Walcott ever meant to carry it. But the rot that remains, in some sense, is precisely both that psychic, that tangible, that intangible. Where does it lodge? It was precisely what Fanon was getting at as well. It's in the materiality, and it's in the very dispositions that people have in the world that are so separate from what is in any way considered colonial history. It's just constantly set aside. So yesterday at this conference, and today, was a conference called, and I'm not claiming this, I'm sorry, but I'm not doing decolonizing knowledge. I think it's an ugly term, and it's not something that I have, but there's something in it that's important. And this was a set of papers, mostly by historians, one poet, and from Nigeria, and it was about what strategies we might use to decolonize knowledge, what I thought it was about. Actually, people ended up giving a lot of papers of just kind of a critique of whatever that conventional history was. But one of my students from the New School, of course, asking the hardest question, at the end of the address that I gave, which that was a keynote, this is not, said, so Anne, tell us what this decolonizing knowledge project has to do with what's going on in Germany now. And I didn't answer him very well. I wrote him an email afterwards and said, sorry, I didn't answer you. But I realized, because I backed off, I said, I shouldn't be telling you about German colonial history. You guys know it so much better than I. But what I should have said was that decolonizing knowledge project was one, the way it was being treated at this conference. It refused the present. It refused colonialism as a history of the present. It didn't even go in that direction. That probably the most powerful form of dissembling, of making difficult, of discomforting, of unsettling those colonial knowledges are the ways in which we understand how they can operate and continue to operate almost behind our backs. And I think that's part of that knowing and not knowing at the same time was an expression. I don't abide by Sartre's notion of bad faith, because I think that's a cop-out. But he did understand that some form of disregard, of looking away, is also having looked first and having known. And that space, that clogged temporality right in there is something that interests me a lot, and that continues in the new book that I've been working on, which is just about finished, the one on duress. I was going to talk about the 3 projects. I was going to talk about the imperial debris, which I hope you have some sense of why that matters to talk about now. I was going to talk about another project which does not belong to me, but is really important, but I don't think we're going to have time for it. And it's a project that's going on that I've been involved in Ramallah at Birzeit University. And it's on imagining what it is to take 10,000 documents that have been collected and what it means to archive Palestine today in a way in the absence of a Palestinian state. What are the ways to archive as a project of dissensus, as an aesthetic of dissensus, as one that doesn't just take over the obverse of the colonial, one that doesn't succumb to the archon and the power of the archive, which already has all of this command. And it does sound sort of, Coles to Newcastle. Why am I being asked to speak about a Palestinian archive when I can barely read 3 words of Arabic, as my friends know? I've tried, but I'm not there yet. But I think it was actually a very bold move on their part, because they were trying to think about what can we imagine this imaginative geography of Palestine to be that doesn't succumb to the imaginative geography of Orientalism and Europe's imagining of what it could be. And I could tell you more about it, but actually don't want to take up that much time. So let me tell you a little bit about the motivation both for the Imperial Debris Project, which is not actually all written out in the book, and this new one. And you can stop me at any moment that is appropriate, since I don't have a clock up here. Okay, okay. So one of the things that I'm really concerned about, and that motivates the new book on duress, which plays off the notion of dur, really hard, that which is intense and hard, durable, that which has a holding power, and duration, which has some temporality to, over time, is to understand something that I think we're not getting at all about the uneven temporalities in which colonialisms survive but also revitalized in other forms. It's something that Achille, a really dear colleague of some of us, Achille Membe, I think he said he was coming, but of course he's not coming, and we all know that about Achille. It's true, he always promises us, he's so seductive. But the post-colony, in some ways, is an effort to get at that kind of grotesque quality in which colonial kinds of governance actually become part of the present in Africa. I'm actually looking at how that happens in Europe and the US. So I'm really interested in taking something, which is a new project I'm working on, and thinking about with Eric Fasson, a French sociologist who works on race and sexuality, of how one might take Pierre Bourdieu's Distinction. Most of us know the book Distinction, right? And we know how subtle it is, and we know how nuanced it is, and we know that it makes these tiny, tiny cuts, right? Within who's the bourgeoisie and who's the haute bourgeoisie and who's below them. What is it that it never, ever, ever touches? What subject? We all know what subject it is. Not one line in that book about distinction in France is about race. Not one line in that book is about colonialism. It's hard to imagine a French bourgeoisie that isn't already deeply saturated with everything colonial about that history. So this project is kind of a project on, that's the book after the one that I was going to talk about, so I'm kind of getting, well, because they're all, I don't actually write books and finish a book, I was telling this to Anu, write a book, then do another one, then do another one. Actually, Along the Archival Grain, the first chapter of it is from 1990, and then 2 books come out in between, and then I go back to that again. In some ways, it's a kind of recursive quality in which I write, in which I think about histories. So one of the things that I'm really concerned about is this clean split And there's kind of arrogance. I think it's a kind of chutzpah, not schutzpah to me, but chutzpah, between the colonial and post-colonial. That we somehow assume that we know what the colonial law is and was, what it looked like. These guys were bad. They weren't you and me. It was black and white. They were real racists. They were biological racists, and we're not. And then we can go on and look at the subtlety of the post-colonial present and how nuanced it is and full of people's interiorities. And I think that's actually a cop-out, and I think that produces a politics of comfort in a way that almost all my work has tried to undermine. Looking at somebody from the 1870s, why his politics of disregard. I gave that paper once in Vancouver, and a young woman, a former Israeli soldier, came up to me and she says, "No one, thank you, has ever described me as well as you just described how I live." Between knowing what she was doing as a young Israeli soldier and also not knowing what she was doing at the same time. So for me, history is always that. Is always being able to not set it apart and feel great about ourselves, but actually make us so uncomfortable with the similarities. That's not saying they're not differences. That's not saying we're the same, that it's exactly the same and it's all one continuous story. But I think that cutoff, that self-satisfaction, that arrogance of imagining it's so different and these people were so much stupider than we. It's the same for the FN, for the Front National. The work that I did in 1997-98 was in the village of Vitrolles, where Le Pen installed his second-hand man, Bruno Maigret's wife. And all my lefty friends said, "Annie, why are you bothering? I mean, we all know Le Pen is nothing, and we all know these are skinheads, and we all know these people aren't very smart." And I said, "No, actually, this is just the tip of the iceberg." This is 97, 98. I was doing the work in Aix-en-Provence. And it's not to say, "Oh, I'm so ahead and I've got it all right," but it's a denial. It's a denial of a history, that it is indeed the Front National is not fascist and Nazi. It is made in France. There was actually a book of that title in English in 1998, but it was not paid attention to very much. So part of what my venture is to keep looking back and forth, to understand something about that cusp of that articulation, not assuming clearly that I know what's post-colonial, but actually what that presence, how that could manifest and what it could be. It's why I'm really uncomfortable with terms like legacy, colonial legacy. Everybody loves it because it lets you off the hook, right? Everything's a legacy. Nobody, then you don't have to go any further into it. So by getting rid of what Foucault called these ready-made syntheses, these concepts that all they do is they couch, they allow you to get by rather than to do the political analysis. That's what these two books in line are trying to do. The reason I call the second one concept work with a slash between concept and work is because concept work is not about borrowing. It's not about taking Foucault's toolbox and carrying it home with you and inserting it. It's about, well, it sounds funny, but you know, he used the term boîte d'utile, unfortunately. Toolboxes, analysis doesn't work that way. Concepts can't be carried that easily. Maybe they travel, but sometimes they get drowned, and sometimes they don't work at all, and sometimes they don't fit the new situations. And what I'm trying to think of here is what concept work can do and why. Not just what it can do because it's an interesting intellectual project, but why certain kinds of concepts that we've used to talk about empire actually get in the way of understanding the presence of colonialisms now. Why a certain notion of the colonial exception? Why we've taken South Asia to be the quintessential model of colonialisms, when in fact what we have so much more of are gradated forms of sovereignty, protectorates, mandates, trusteeships, military bases, military islands, you name it, we've got them all over. If you do a map, the actual map of the Middle East and a lot of the US holdings and a lot of other holdings don't fit in the South Asia Subaltern Studies model at all. So the question is, why have we taken that? That's the subject of this other book, its introduction, looking at what we did in 1978 with Orientalism and how we set Orientalism as the text, as the iconic text in which we would be able to then study Emily Bronte and Jane Austen and produce tons of other dissertations. And why we put the question of Palestine, written 1 year later, on the very cusp of that book to the side as the political Said. One was our intellectual, kind of progressive Edward at Columbia, right? We all loved him. And actually, he was a friend, so I'm not saying it in that way. But why these two distinct Saids were set aside. And I'm saying that among the most progressive of those people in colonial studies itself. My friends and me. I'm not pointing fingers elsewhere. As Foucault argued, critique is the art of reflective insolence. It is not insolence towards somebody else, it's insolence towards yourself. It's the capacity, right, to do that and to understand what kind of risk that puts you at. So one of the projects of this new book on duress is to think the project of what colonial studies might have looked like if those two books had been kept together. Nick Dirks, a colleague, a dear colleague at the time, said in 1990 that, he said, I'm worried. Colonial studies is making itself safe for scholarship. Well, I think he got it wrong. I think colonial studies was made safe for scholarship to not talk about Israel and to not talk about what the US was doing from 1978, 79, right at the beginning of colonial studies. How carefully Israel has been kept out of the picture. How carefully US imperial pursuits in the Middle East have not been part of the picture of colonial studies. Over and again, you can go through any of the volumes you want, including mine with Fred Cooper, Tensions of Empire, including Haunted by Empire, just on that cusp before 9/11. Over and again, Amy Kaplan's on cultures of imperialism. One after another, the first 15 years after Orientalism, not one book, not one, in colonial studies, post-colonial studies, has Israel in it. Ella Shohat, we know she did, but we also know that the argument that this was a settler colonial situation was made much earlier on. It was already there. Who was it? Amin, who wrote it? I just forgot the name. Anyway, I'm allowed. I'm totally on jet lag. I'm leaving tomorrow. So that's one of the projects, to understand what kind of other political project it might look like. But in doing this, something else has happened to me, and it goes back to the writing of the discussion I was having with Anu, because it wrestles with poesy and metaphor, not just as a way of getting in the way of conceptual generation, but actually a site of conceptual form, as a place to look to, that somehow this more social science mode that we were in for so long actually seems to me to get in the way. And I'm saying this because over and again, and it's the really honor and privilege of being, one of the old guys now, I'm invited to think about things that I not had an opportunity to think about. So I was out at UBC, and they were doing a project of installation artists and poets and Native American indigenous movements, and asking, is there a possibility of imagining a utopia? And that's not already colonized in some form. So it's that language again of trying to, and I'm so struck by how much we need this aesthetic form and thinking through these aesthetics that Rancière, somebody like Jacques Rancière, offers to us, that the census is there. It's not apart from, it's not a little additive, it's not the supplement, that it actually puts other kinds of demands on how we write and on how we think. And I feel very humble in the face of that. So people have said to me, Anne, your writing's changed so much. And I don't know, I feel like it's the politics of that has changed. There's a different kind of urgency, it's not so distant. There's something else in which it has to be conveyed in a different kind of way. I didn't even get to tell you about the new book very much. I'm excited by it because it's really, it's not that it's got all the answers, it's no resolution. It's merely a set of experiments in thinking about ways to just keep finding this ethics of discomfort. One of the chapters is titled Colonial Aphasia. One of them is on colony and camp. It's tracking the history of the ways in which the concept of colony and the concept of camp, of penal colony, of colonie agricole, of camps in Algeria that were vitalized as settlements in other kinds of colonies, but then turned back into military camps. What is going on there in that deadly embrace between colony and camp historically? And obviously I'm thinking through Palestine. I'm thinking through Israel, of that very, very tight relation between colony and camp, rather than thinking of colony as this non-conceptual space. Another chapter is entitled Reason Aside. And it's really a kind of critique of the whole science model of subaltern studies that basically argued, you know, it's the supremacy of reason. It's the violence of reason. That's why we have colonialism and empire. Well, sentiment mattered a lot. The distribution of sentiment, who you could have sentiments toward, what affective states you could have towards whom, who you could pity, who you could sympathize with, who you could not, what kind of hierarchies those set up. That's a theme that runs through a lot of the work that I've been doing. But it's not that it just runs through the 19th century. I think if we look at regimes of security now, and we look at the politics of fear and the construction of how an enemy, as an epistemic object, as Heinz-Jörg Reinberger would tell us, as an epistemic object that creates certain kinds of knowledge and certain kinds of subjects, we'll find that affect is at the core of security regimes, whether it be fear, humiliation, dispositions of comportment in all sorts of ways. Anyway, that's some of what I'm thinking right now, and I hope that it offers you something to think with. I didn't prepare this in the way I do usually clean and neat keynote address, but thought that I would offer it just more as some things to think with. So thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing your thought with us. And now I want to invite everybody to come up with questions and comments.
You needn't, you don't have to.
Yeah, but there's already, I have to, you're doing it like this, okay.
Thank you for this wonderful lecture. I love that you...
Is your name?
My name is Daniel. I love that you opened your lecture with Hanneken's cachet, and you repeatedly mentioned discomfort, the relevance and the importance of the relevance and the importance of discomfort. So I was wondering whether you could share some, some work and a visual work, artistic work in the U.S. Specifically that matters for you in your struggle, in your topic, beyond the wonderful Amy Goodman and Democracy Now! And publications in colonial studies in this context, because you briefly mentioned some the relevance of artistic work, and I was wondering whether you could share some names that you would kind of...
Thank you for the question. I don't know if I can answer it yet. It's like my mind has been open. I've always used novels. I've always thought with poetry. Be that by Dutch colonizers or not, right? Imagery. I've just been struck by the ways in which in the Native American movement, some people want to call it the indigeneity movement, whatever it's, hot this week, whatever, that something's going on there. And something's going on that's not just a knee-jerk. There's several people who I think are young and strong, and what they're doing is turning away from a politics of recognition towards a politics of refusal. And the refusal is taking different forms. It's saying, I don't need you to tell me I'm okay. I don't need you to see me, right? I find that great. I find that powerful. And it's not as if they invented it, excuse me. I mean, we all know that. But there's something else happening, and it's not like it's great art. That's kind of what, so when I went and saw some of this exhibition that was done for this, it was called Indigenizing Utopias. And it was at the art school. And I've been invited to do things in geography and the history of science. Something's going on in which people are searching for another way to compute this, another grammar that isn't just bound up with the one in which we've been in. And I think Israel and Palestine and the way in which the BDS movement, that's the boycott movement, right, has had a stronger resonance. Something's happening, and it's lining up in some interesting and also some flat ways with what's going on with indigeneity movements, but in which Gaitre's notion that the subaltern can't speak is no longer relevant. Okay, there are places, and we know, and you could say, wait a minute, who's gonna really listen? There's something, there's a new political space is opening up, and I think that's some of the excitement that Rancière's offered us, is to understand that it's not that these political spaces were sitting there untapped. They're actually creating new political spaces, right? And I can see it in what my students are working on. I can just see how they're working differently with vinyl, with old. I've got a student who's working on young people listening to the vinyl that their fathers listened to at the time that supposedly and probably was more, 1 million Indonesians were killed. The act of killing, and you all know that he's done the second, right? What is it called? The second? The look of sight. Science. So there's something going, and they're looking at, and I know it's too cool for words. Everybody's talking about the sensorium, but there is something going on with sensibility, senses, sensorium, hearing, sound, that's not just the text. And I find that really, it's not my domain. It's not the way I worked. But it's really powerful, and one has to listen, right? And learn how to listen differently. So thank you for that question.
Hello, thank you. My name is Federico. So I was about to ask something little different, but you anticipated somehow the answer, so I would like you to, if you don't mind, to elaborate again on what you are saying, which was very interesting. You were mentioning the political refusal, so I'm wondering what kind of sentiment would be necessary to mobilize in order to make it possible.
Wow.
There is kind of politics.
Well, this is what I've been working on. This is what I've been working on. Did everybody hear his question about what kind of sentiments? So I've been teaching for the last decade in different ways, but it's transformed enormously on the politics of sentiment, on apathy, sympathy, ressentiment, and trying to understand, and despair, and trying to understand those moments and those sites in which something we've already imagined is a site of despair turns into actually a critical project. So there's some really interesting work right now on ressentiment. We all know from Nietzsche that ressentiment, you don't want to have it. It eats your guts out. It's the worst thing in the world. This is work by Thomas Brudham on ressentiment as moral virtue. What are the spaces that ressentiment can afford you and offer you to do something you were not able to do otherwise? Not as a form of paralysis, not as a form that just beats you down, but that actually opens a space. So my students have been doing a lot of work on taking these affective concepts that we've assumed already. Stefania Pandolfo has brilliant work. Do people know her work on young Moroccan men who hide themselves in these big tanks so they can get into Europe? And she looks through Islamic concepts at how their notions of despair are actually a form of critique and are actually an evaluation of their lives, not suicidal. That jihad actually has a personal piece to it. That it's not just something that's out there, that's actually about the cultivation of the self. Whether these are right or wrong, it's about something going on right now in which we're trying to understand that the very ways in which we've decided what is demobilizing can actually be something else. And for me, that's very powerful because I've been spending the last 6 years getting as often as I can, which is not often enough, to Ramallah, to Nablus, to Hebron, to as many places as I can go, even with my lack of language and lack of Hebrew and lack of Arabic, because there's something going on and it's not romanticizing it. It's what people live at the same time. They live both the colonial existence and something that's beyond the colonial, right? It's not like post. It's like they get something that I'm just totally, truly fascinated with, that capacity to live those. So I was speaking last night about Joseph Massoud, who's written that, people in Palestine have to live the colonial and the post-colonial, that everybody, there's the colonial here and the post-colonial there. And what I basically think is he got it wrong. I think that people live both at the same time. That that's the dilemma. That's what it looks like now. That's what it looks like in Antigua. That's what it looks like in Hawaii. That's what it looks like in Samoa. That I think there's something going on about how those temporalities are lived that we still have not done that work on. So those were the two most interesting papers from the conference that I was at for the last 2 days, trying to think about not just that multiple temporalities is multiculturalism and good, and the monolithic linear temporality of the West is Eurocentric, but that something else, that we need more space to be thinking, how people live in multiple regimes of time at the same time, that it's not just about memory. There's something more complicated, and memory studies doesn't quite do it. In fact, I think it's gotten in our way.
Thank you for the talk. My name is Patrick.
Hi, Patrick.
I was really interested in what you were talking about in the sort of professional trajectory of post-colonial studies, choosing one side over the other, which I think is really interesting. In a lot of debates that I've seen going on recently, there have been a lot of questions about why in particular anyone who's trying to do something anti-colonial or leftist in the academy is encouraged to go into literary studies,
Right.
into cultural studies, into anthropology, and sort of abandon things like anything quantitative of any kind, or abandon...
Agent Orange, which is just sitting there, or the environment, or...
Exactly. And I think that's... I'm really interested in how... I mean, in particular, the way that we understand the role of capitalism in colonialism.
Yeah.
I feel like overall, because of the sort of humanities focus among anti-colonial theory, a lot of the time, the understanding of capitalism is that it's bad and that it intersects things.
Yeah.
But there isn't like a really deep understanding of what are the shifts in global capital that are making these places or these places or these places new targets. Like, it's very obvious in Canada with the
Yep.
new attacks on Indigenous people's land around oil resources. So my question is just like, I don't want to get too schematic about how each discipline allows you to only ask certain types of questions, but I would like to know what your thoughts are in terms of
I
this
think
division.
that it's a great issue that you're bringing up, and I think that it's actually your generation that is going to bring that back again. I mean, this is too long a conversation, and it's one that one of my dearest colleagues in the world, who we lost several years ago, Fernando Coraniel, and I have been having and had for years, right? Because so much of his work just stayed fundamentally about capitalism, fundamentally about ground rent, fundamentally about, and Annie, why are you going to this Foucault? I said, well, I see the two, in line. But something's happened, and I don't know if no one's really written it. It comes out in a few sentences in Amy Kaplan's work. It comes out a little bit in Robert Young, but that somehow imperialism we left it aside. We were all studying. Look, as a graduate student, it's all I read was, I didn't read anthropology. I didn't know anthropology. All I read was What Is to Be Done. All I read was Rosa Luxemburg. All I read is The Last Stage of Capitalism as Imperialism. This is Lenin. We read and saw imperialism as absolutely crucial. But we're also reading Wallerstein. I mean, what is he, 85 now? But he got something that we all ended up rejecting, a kind of functionalism. There's the periphery, there's the core. Well, we rejected that whole notion. How do you know that's the core of what, right? And we all went in to start arguing for multiple capitalisms, and there was no core, about it. But he did get something about the world capitalist system. He really did. And there, capitalism still mattered. But then we had a turn. And it came through also a lot of subaltern studies who were all reading the Journal of Economic and Political Weekly. They were writing in it. They were the old-time Marxists. All of the names you guys know went to the cultural turn. It went, culture is the site of domination. How did we miss it? Well, somehow in that move, the economics just got kind of cut out. Because it was so, and I don't mean because, that was not a because we need to discuss the because among us all. No, we really do. I think there are many becauses. I think it's probably overdetermined. It's what happened with communism, what happened with the turn of, most French intellectuals from this Communist Party over to the Socialist Party, what happened with, Said's work, why it was seen as so anti-Marxist when everything that Said wrote in both of those books was so much about configurations of power, economic investments, political investments on the ground. What did we take from it was something else. So I think what we're seeing, and it may be through environmentalism, and it may be through some other spaces, is a return to this other kind of materiality of these inequities. How people are in Zygmunt Bauman's sense. Wasted lives are made, and how wastelands are perpetuated. These all have genealogies through colonial histories, Wüstenland, as we know. I don't know, I haven't written that account yet. Maybe some of you know someone who's really made that, because usually there's a reference back to it, and then a too quick turn to the intimacies of empire. Why have we taken intimacy, and I'm part of the problem, to be about domestic relations and breastfeeding when it should be about torture as well? That's just as intimate. It's just as intimate. It's just as close to your body. It's just as close up. So in the second edition of Carnal Knowledge and Imperial Power, which some of you may know, some of you may not, it was first published in 2002. The new introduction to it is a critique of the book itself, which I'd wanted to put in the book originally, and I was told not to. They said, you can't critique your own book before it's out. And I said, but there's a problem here, right? There's a real problem here. And in fact, when it came out in French last year, La Découverte refused to put the introduction first. They said, you're going to undermine the book, and they made it the epilogue. But I think the real point is, what do we mean by intimacy? What do we mean by intrusion? What do we mean about something coming close to the flesh, right? And to the core of who you are. So thank you for asking it, because it needs to be addressed. And probably it's some of my generation with you together that we have to be seeing. So what is the lay of the land right now? Right? What does this look like? Why is this stuff in environmentalism? And that's one of the places I took as an example, Agent Orange. Why is it considered a collateral damage of war and not of empire? When people are making demands, they couldn't make them, they couldn't get any retribution on it, only veterans could get it. And in Canada, the towns where there was Agent Orange, they couldn't get anything either. So there's a film that's been done in Canada on it now, in New Brunswick. I mean, but these are stories, they're cut off. They're severed histories, right? That's what I see as a collective task. No one can do it alone, right? One of the most searing things to me is when I was lecturing in Canada, and I learned that South African officials came to Canada to visit the reservations in the 1950s to figure out how to make Bantustans work well. When I read that, it was like everything I've been doing since 1980s. I felt like that, yes, this is right. Why don't I know this history? So I tracked down the guy who wrote it. And then I tracked down the guy who he quoted, and it stopped right there. And I've never been able, so one of you, one of the younger generation, is going to do that. Because how did that work? That's better than a global history. That's a history of globalized logics of governance that are operating in so many insidious ways. The Bantustans and the reservations in Canada, right? I already tracked the Carnegie Commission, right, on eugenics from Kentucky to the proto-apartheid state, but there was much more. So I think there's a lot to be done, because I think the resonances are right here, right now.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Kaabi. I have always strongly believed into the cultural productivity of dissensus. So I liked a lot what you said about that. In dealing with cultural heritage, I have to deal with dissensus every time. And I always had this wonderful idea that one day we would agree about the dissensus.
Who's we?
So agree to disagree.
Who's we?
And be we, those people who deal with cultural heritage and defend it against whatever capital or damage-making mechanism. So what I found striking, and this is my question now, is what you said about the archives of Palestine without a state, and you said it's a project of dissensus and not on dissensus. For me, this makes a big difference, because if it was on dissensus, we could stick to this model of agreeing to disagree. And what I feel, and perhaps I'm wrong, is that you don't mean that you mean to stick to the dissensus and to make it a project of dissent, that dissent does not end. And you feel not comfortable with it, and this would be the aim. So stick to discomfort and dissensus. Did I understand this?
Yes, you did.
Okay,
yes,
so
you
then
did.
I would love to know in perhaps a little detail on this Palestine question and the archive.
Well, it's actually a 30-page paper, and it's a 300-page book that came before it. No, that's nothing. That was not to put you down in any way. There's no reason you should know it. But I've spent a lot of the last 25 years writing on the nature of the archive and the authority that certain kinds of both content and form are given to archival documents, to the commissions, to the way in which they're written, to the ritualized language within it. That was why I was invited, because of my politics as well, but because I've been working on archives so assiduously for so long. And what the challenge was, is to imagine, is it possible to not write an archiving Palestine that says the subaltern is resisting, or everybody's memory that says subaltern is real and authentic. And let's just put in the stories of the real people and we'll know what happened. And let's confine it to Palestinians alone. Well, everything I've done for 30 years, it says you can't do that. That doesn't get you from here to there in any way that I think is actually about what it means to be governed and to not be governed, as Foucault defines, another way of defining critique, by these people in this way. How much is that, and it's the same issue of how much epistemically these forms of authority lodged inside the ways we know the world. That's why this affect and the sentiment has been so important to me. So I've written a lot on that and on race and why affect is actually crucial. You're asking such a, I'm not good at, after so many questions, telling you the work of the last 20 years. But what I'm trying to do is offer something without being presumptuous, that I can know what is needed in this to do with these 10,000 documents, but whether there's something about what I've done about the power of the archive that could help not let people get caught by those forms that are reactive to it alone. I mean, Taguieff did a lot of work on this, on race. He said, you know what's happened? The anti-racist movement has ended up repeating every one of the categories of racial categories. How do you get out of that kind of gesture? And so that's why I say it's already dissensus to be writing against it in a way that actually tries to come up with another form. It's not just content. It's not just the voices of the oppressed. It's literally, and goes back to our question about aesthetics, it goes back, it's about form as well, because form seems so benign. Form seems, it just goes so easily. And I find it actually one of the most politically pernicious sites. And also with the most potential on both sides. So thank you for your question.
Yes, okay. Thank you so much.
say one more thing? May I say one more thing? One more thing that returns us to Simon, returns us to Bonaventure. He started off saying that what Simon did in this exhibition was risky, and it took guts. And I think that's one of the most critical things that one wants to take away from what we're trying to all do in very different registers. One of the ways in which Foucault defined off the Greek definition of parrhesia is fearless speech, where you put yourself at some risk. And if you haven't put yourself at some risk, it's probably not worth doing, but you at least should be asking, is there some kind of risk that you're not creating another comfort zone? And obviously Simon's work has done that for so many people.
I will say thank you, Anne. Thank you, Simon, for this passionate proposals and questions and some answers and statements. Thank you very much. So we're going to continue next week, Thursday to Sunday. So feel free to come by, join us. Before ending, I want to say something, and I cannot just package it in this, but the subtitle of Savvy Contemporary is the Laboratory of Form Ideas. So we hope that with such projects, exhibitions, roundtable discussions, lectures, we are able to create these platforms where we can really bring forms and ideas together, or we bring them apart, but we have the possibility of reflecting on them. So please join us next week. And once more, thank you very much. Despite all odds, thanks for coming. Thanks to the ICI for this wonderful space, the wonderful energy and everything. Thank you.